Rose wiped the coffee stain from her uniform and sighed. Another 12-hour shift at the diner had left her feet aching and her wallet still frustratingly empty. Tips had been poor today, and the stack of unpaid bills waiting at her tiny apartment seemed to grow taller every week. Her mother's medical treatments weren't covered by insurance, and the debt collectors called daily. Just one more table, she whispered to herself, forcing a smile as she approached the corner booth. A man sat alone, his expensive suit standing out among the diner's usual customers. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and when he looked up from his phone, Rose felt her breath catch. His eyes were piercing blue, intense and calculating as they assessed her. "Coffee black," he said, his voice deep and commanding. He didn't even glance at the menu. Rose nodded and hurried to get his order. When she returned, he was watching her with unusual interest. "You're Rose," he said, reading her name tag. "I've been watching you work. You're efficient, detail-oriented." Rose shifted uncomfortably. "Is there something else I can get you, sir?" The man extended his hand. "I'm Jack Reynolds." The name sounded familiar. Then Rose remembered seeing it in the business section of the newspaper. Jack Reynolds, owner of Reynolds Enterprises, worth billions. "I have a business proposition for you," Jack said, sliding a card across the table. "Call this number tonight. It could solve all your financial problems." Rose looked at the card skeptically. "I'm not interested in anything inappropriate." Jack's expression remained neutral. "This is strictly business. 24 hours of your time for $50,000. Rose nearly dropped her coffee pot. $50,000 would cover her mother's treatments, pay off her debts, maybe even allow her to finish her degree. "Why me?" she asked, suspicious. "I need a wife," Jack stated flatly, "for exactly one day." Later that evening, Rose found herself in the lobby of the city's most exclusive building. The security guard escorted her to the penthouse, where Jack opened the door himself. "You came," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Good." Jack's apartment was minimalist but clearly expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering city below. Rose felt out of place in her worn jeans and faded sweater. "I need to appear married," Jack explained, pouring 2 glasses of wine and offering one to Rose. "I'm negotiating with investors from overseas. Traditional men who believe a stable family indicates a stable business partner. They've rejected my proposals 3 times because I'm single." Rose took a small sip of wine, its rich flavor unlike anything she'd tasted before. "So you want me to pretend to be your wife? For one day. We'll have a private ceremony tomorrow morning, legally binding but with divorce papers already prepared. You'll attend a dinner with the investors tomorrow night, and by the following morning we'll end it. You get $50,000, I get my business deal." Rose set down her glass. "Why not ask someone you know? A friend?" Jack's expression hardened slightly. "My social circle is aware of my business dealings. You're unknown, a clean slate." Rose thought of her mother in the hospital, of the eviction notice on her door. She thought of the desperation she felt each morning, waking up to the same endless struggle. "No physical expectations," she stated firmly. "None," Jack agreed. "This is purely business. We'll have separate rooms here. Everything will be outlined in the contract." Jack walked to his desk and returned with a thick document. "My lawyer drafted this today. Take your time reading it." Rose's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The terms were clear. Pretend to be deeply in love with Jack Reynolds for 24 hours, sign some papers, attend a dinner, then disappear from his life with enough money to change her own. "If I agree," she said finally, "I want the money placed in escrow before the ceremony, and I want proof it will be transferred to me regardless of how your deal goes." Jack's lips curved into the faintest smile, the first break in his businesslike demeanor. "You're smarter than most people would assume, Rose. I admire that." He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Rose looked at his hand, then back at his face. Something in his eyes made her heart beat faster, something that suggested there might be more to Jack Reynolds than cold business calculations. She took his hand. "We have a deal." The next morning, Rose found herself standing in front of an exclusive boutique in the city's fashion district. Jack had arranged everything, including a sleek black car that picked her up at dawn. "Mr. Reynolds has instructed us to give you the complete treatment," said the boutique owner, a slender woman named Olivia who looked Rose up and down with a critical eye. "We have 6 hours to transform you into Mrs. Reynolds." Rose followed Olivia through the store, past racks of clothing with no price tags, a sure sign that everything was too expensive for ordinary people. 3 attendants whisked her into a private dressing room lined with mirrors. "First, we need measurements," Olivia declared. "Everything must be perfect." Rose stood awkwardly as they measured every inch of her body. She had never felt so exposed. The attendants spoke about her as if she weren't there. "Good bone structure. The eyes are striking. We'll need to do something about those hands. Waitressing has roughened them." After measurements came hair. The stylist tusked at Rose's simple ponytail, cutting inches off the length and adding subtle highlights that made her brown hair shine with golden undertones. Next was makeup, not too heavy, but expertly applied to enhance her features. Mr. Reynolds specifically requested natural beauty, the makeup artist explained. He said there was plenty to work with. Rose blushed at the compliment. Had Jack really said that? The dress they brought was midnight blue, form-fitting but elegant, with a neckline that hinted at cleavage without being obvious. When Rose slipped it on, the silk felt like water against her skin. "Now shoes," Olivia announced, presenting a box containing high heels that probably cost more than Rose's monthly rent. "I can't walk in these," Rose protested. "You will learn," Olivia stated firmly. Mrs. Reynolds would know how. For the next hour, Rose practiced walking, sitting, and even eating in her new outfit. Olivia drilled her on proper etiquette for the dinner that evening. "The investors are from old money. They notice everything," Olivia explained. "You must appear to be deeply in love with Jack, but never inappropriate in public. A touch of his arm, a knowing glance. These are the signs of a sophisticated couple." Rose's head spun with all the rules. "How long have you worked for Jack?" "Mr. Reynolds," Olivia corrected, "has been my employer for 7 years. He is brilliant but demanding, and very private." "Has he done this before? Hired a fake wife?" Olivia's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Reynolds' personal affairs are not my concern. Now let's discuss his background. You should know he grew up in Boston, attended Harvard, built his company from nothing after his father lost everything in a bad investment." By late afternoon, Rose barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked like she belonged in Jack's world, sophisticated, beautiful, confident. The boutique door opened and Jack himself walked in. He stopped abruptly when he saw Rose, his usual composed expression slipping for just a moment. "You look," he started, then cleared his throat. "The transformation is impressive." Rose felt a strange flutter in her stomach at his reaction. "Is it enough to convince your investors?" Jack stepped closer, his eyes moving over her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "More than enough." He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "There's one final touch." Inside was a diamond ring that caught the light in dazzling rainbows. Rose gasped despite herself. "It's worth more than most houses," Jack said matter-of-factly. "Security will be watching you at all times, so don't get any ideas." Rose stiffened at the implication. "I'm not a thief." "I didn't say you were," Jack replied smoothly. "But $50,000 is one thing. This ring is quite another." He took her left hand, his touch surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her. When his eyes met hers, something electric passed between them. "The car will take you to my penthouse," Jack said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "The ceremony is in 1 hour." As he turned to leave, Rose called after him. "Jack." He paused, looking back. "Thank you for saying I had natural beauty to work with," she said softly. For the first time, she saw genuine surprise on his face. Then his lips curved into a small smile, not the practiced business smile she'd seen before, but something real. "I only stated the obvious," he said quietly, and then he was gone, leaving Rose staring at the diamond on her finger and wondering what she had gotten herself into. Jack's penthouse was transformed when Rose arrived. White roses filled every surface, and soft music played in the background. A man in a formal suit stood near the windows, alongside a woman holding a folder of documents. "My lawyer and his assistant," Jack explained as he guided Rose inside with a hand lightly touching her lower back. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her body, and our efficient should arrive any moment. Rose nodded, suddenly nervous. This was really happening. In minutes, she would legally become Mrs. Reynolds, even if only for a day. The papers? She asked quietly. Jack gestured to the lawyer. Tom has prepared everything. The divorce papers are already signed by me and will be filed tomorrow afternoon. The money is in escrow, as you requested. The doorbell rang and Jack's assistant admitted an older man carrying a small book. The efficient Rose realized this was moving too fast. Could I have a moment? She asked Jack. He looked at her closely. Second thoughts? No, just a minute to breathe. Jack nodded to the others, who politely stepped onto the balcony. He turned to Rose, his blue eyes searching her face. You can still walk away, he said softly. No harm done. Rose shook her head. I need the money, but this feels so dishonest, Jack supplied. Strange, Rose corrected. Yesterday I was serving coffee. Today I'm marrying a millionaire. Billionaire, Jack corrected with a small smile. If we're being technical. Despite her nerves, Rose laughed. Does that make you feel better, having so much money? Something flickered in Jack's eyes. Money solves practical problems, not emotional ones. He hesitated, then added, My father taught me that the hard way. Before Rose could ask what he meant, Jack straightened his already perfect tie. We should begin. The investors have moved the dinner up by an hour. Everyone returned to their positions. The ceremony was simple and brief. The officiant spoke about duties and responsibilities, words Rose knew neither she nor Jack took seriously. Yet when the time came to exchange rings, Jack also wearing a simple gold band now, Rose felt her heart race. With this ring I thee wed, Jack said, his voice deeper than usual as he held her hand. The diamond felt heavy on her finger, like a beautiful anchor tying her temporarily to this man. When she repeated the words and slid the gold band onto his finger, their eyes met. Something passed between them, something neither had anticipated. You may kiss the bride, the officiant announced. Rose hadn't thought about this part. By Jack's momentary hesitation, neither had he. Jack leaned forward slowly, giving her time to offer only her cheek. Instead, Rose found herself turning slightly, allowing his lips to brush against hers. What was meant to be a brief, formal touch lingered. Jack's lips were warm and surprisingly soft. The gentle pressure sent a jolt through Rose's body that had nothing to do with their arrangement. When they separated, Jack's eyes were darker, his breathing slightly uneven. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, the officiant said, oblivious to the tension between them. The lawyer stepped forward with more papers. Just a few signatures to complete the legal requirements. Rose signed where indicated her new signature, Rose Reynolds, feeling foreign in her hand. Jack's shoulder brushed against hers as he leaned in to sign his own name, and she caught his scent, expensive cologne with something uniquely him underneath. Now to celebrate, Jack announced once the officiant and lawyer had left. He opened a bottle of champagne that had been chilling, pouring 2 glasses. To a successful partnership, he said, handing one to Rose. Their fingers touched during the exchange, and Rose felt that same spark of electricity. Jack seemed to feel it too, because he pulled back quickly, almost spilling the champagne. I should get ready for dinner, Rose said, needing space to clear her head. Jack nodded. Your things have been moved to the guest suite. Olivia laid out everything you'll need. As Rose turned to go, Jack called after her. Rose? She paused, looking back at him. Thank you, he said simply. Not many people would do this. Something in his expression made Rose's heart flutter. There was gratitude there, yes, but something more. A vulnerability she hadn't seen before. It's just business, right? She said, repeating his words from yesterday. Jack nodded, but his eyes told a different story. Just business. As Rose walked toward the guest room, she realized her heart was racing. Just 24 hours, she reminded herself. Then she would return to her real life, $50,000 richer but otherwise unchanged. So why did that thought suddenly make her feel empty? The restaurant was the most exclusive in the city, located on the top floor of a towering building with views that made Rose catch her breath. Glass chandeliers sparkled overhead, and waiters moved silently between tables draped in crisp white linen. Jack placed his hand on Rose's lower back as they followed the host to a private dining room. His touch felt both protective and possessive, sending warmth through her body despite the thin fabric of her dress. "Ready?" Jack whispered, his lips close to her ear. "Remember, these men are traditional. They believe in family values above all." Rose nodded, suddenly afraid her waitressing experience wouldn't be enough for this performance. "What if I say something wrong?" Jack's hand moved to her shoulder, turning her gently to face him. "Just be yourself. That's why I chose you." His words gave her unexpected confidence. The private room door opened, revealing 3 older men in expensive suits rising from their chairs. "Gentlemen," Jack said, his voice warm as he guided Rose forward. "May I present my wife, Rose." "Wife?" The oldest investor looked surprised, his eyebrows rising. "When did this happen, Reynolds?" "Last we met, you were quite the bachelor." Jack smiled, his arm wrapping around Rose's waist. "When you meet the right woman, why wait? We married this morning." Rose felt the men studying her, judging whether she was worthy of Jack Reynolds. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting their gaze. "Please sit," the second investor said, gesturing to the empty chairs. "We're eager to know how Jack managed to convince such a lovely woman to marry him." As they took their seats, Jack's hand found hers under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. The waiter arrived with champagne, pouring crystal flutes for everyone. The oldest investor raised his glass, to new beginnings in marriage and perhaps in business. Through the first course, the men asked polite questions about their relationship. Jack had prepared simple answers. They'd met 6 months ago, fallen in love quickly. But the investors wanted details Rose hadn't rehearsed. "What attracted you to Jack?" the third investor asked, his eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. Rose hesitated, then decided truth might sound more convincing than fiction. "His certainty," she said softly. "In a world where most people doubt themselves, Jack knows exactly who he is and what he wants." She felt Jack's surprise beside her, his fingers tightening around his fork. The investors nodded approvingly. The conversation shifted to business, complex terms Rose didn't understand. She focused on being the perfect partner, attentive, supportive, occasionally touching Jack's arm or sharing a private smile with him. When dessert arrived, the oldest investor addressed her directly. "Mrs. Reynolds, what do you think of your husband's proposal for expanding into Asian markets?" Jack tensed beside her. This wasn't a question they'd prepared for. Rose took a sip of water, buying time. Then she remembered conversations with customers at the diner, the immigrant family that ran the grocery store near her apartment, how they talked about business back home. "My father owned a small shop," she said, the lie coming smoothly. "He always said understanding local families was key to any business." Jack's approach focuses on adapting to cultural needs rather than imposing Western models. That's what makes his vision special. The investors looked impressed. Under the table, Jack's hand found her thigh, squeezing gently in silent thanks. His touch lingered, fingers warm through the silk of her dress, sending a flutter of desire through her body. As the meal concluded, the lead investor signed the preliminary documents Jack had brought. "Your wife is not only beautiful but insightful, Reynolds. You've chosen well, in business and in marriage." Outside, waiting for their car, Jack pulled Rose into a shadowed alcove away from prying eyes. "That was incredible," he said, his voice low and intense. "How did you know what to say about the Asian markets?" Rose shrugged. "I listened to people at the diner. You'd be surprised what you learn serving coffee." Jack was standing very close, his eyes moving over her face as if seeing her for the first time. "You're remarkable, Rose," he said softly. "Truly remarkable." In the dim light, his gaze dropped to her lips. Rose felt her heart racing, her body responding to his nearness. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, really kiss her, not the formal peck from the ceremony. The car pulled up, breaking the spell between them. Jack stepped back, straightening his tie, his business demeanor returning. "The hard part's over," he said, helping her into the car. "Just a few more hours of marriage to go." Rose smiled and nodded, but as they drove back to the penthouse in silence, she wondered why the thought of their arrangement ending left her feeling strangely hollow. Back at the penthouse, Jack loosened his tie and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Rose as thunder rumbled in the distance. "To a successful dinner," he said, clinking his glass against hers. "You were magnificent." Those investors have rejected my proposals 3 times. Tonight, they practically begged to work with me. Rose took a small sip, the expensive liquor burning pleasantly down her throat. So our arrangement worked. Better than I expected. Jack's eyes lingered on her face. You're full of surprises, Rose. She smiled, feeling strangely comfortable in his presence now. So what happens in the morning? We sign the divorce papers and I walk away. Something flickered in Jack's expression. That was the agreement. He moved to the wall of windows, looking out at the city lights and the storm gathering on the horizon. The money will be transferred to your account by noon. Rose joined him at the window, their reflections ghostly in the glass. You never told me why you built all this, she said softly. Why is this deal so important? Jack was quiet for a long moment. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating his face. My father was wealthy once, he finally said, but he lost everything on a bad investment when I was 15. He couldn't handle the failure. He took his own life. Rose's breath caught. Jack, I'm sorry. I swore I'd rebuild everything he lost, prove it could be done. His voice was tight with emotion he clearly rarely shared. This deal is the final piece. After this, I'll have 10 times what he lost. And then what? Rose asked. Jack looked at her, confusion in his eyes. What do you mean? When you've proven whatever you're trying to prove, what will you do then? Before he could answer, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The penthouse plunged into darkness, lit only by occasional flashes of lightning. Storm must have knocked out the power, Jack said, his voice closer than Rose expected. She felt his hand find her arm. There are candles in the kitchen. Stay here. Minutes later, the penthouse was bathed in soft candlelight. Rose had slipped off her high heels, curling up on the sofa while Jack built a fire in the marble fireplace. Without electricity, the silence felt deeper, more intimate. You never answered my question, Rose said as Jack sat beside her on the sofa, closer than necessary. What happens after you win? Jack stared into his glass. I don't know. I've never thought beyond this goal. That's sad, Rose said simply. His head jerked up. Sad. To only look forward, never around. She hesitated, then added, My mother always said life happens in the spaces between plans. Your mother sounds wise. She is. That's why I need the money. For her medical treatments. Rose twisted the diamond ring on her finger. She raised me alone after my father left. Worked 3 jobs sometimes. Jack studied her in the flickering light. You're very different from the women I usually meet. Because I'm not rich? Because you're real, he said quietly. The air between them seemed to change, growing warmer, charged with something Mather had expected. Jack's eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, asking a silent question. Rose knew she should move away. This was business, nothing more. But something stronger than reason pulled her toward him. Their lips met softly at first, tentative. Then Jack's hand moved to cup her face, and the kiss deepened. Rose felt herself melting against him, her body responding with an intensity that shocked her. His other hand slid around her waist, drawing her closer. This wasn't part of our arrangement, Jack whispered against her mouth, giving her one last chance to stop. Rose answered by reaching for his shirt buttons. I don't care. The candlelight cast golden shadows as clothing fell away. Jack's hands moved over her body with reverent exploration, discovering places that made her gasp and arch against him. His muscled body was nothing like she had imagined, a scar on his shoulder, another across his ribs, humanizing the perfect businessman she'd first seen. On the soft rug before the fire, they came together with an urgency that surprised them both. Jack whispered her name against her skin like a prayer. Rose felt herself opening to him completely, not just physically but emotionally, barriers falling away with each caress. Afterward, wrapped in the throw blanket from the sofa, Rose rested her head on Jack's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. That definitely wasn't in the contract, Jack said, his voice rumbling under her ear. Rose laughed softly. Will you sue me for breach of contract, Mr. Reynolds? He tilted her face up to his, suddenly serious. I'm beginning to think our arrangement might need renegotiating. Morning light filtered through the curtains, waking Rose slowly. For a moment, she was disoriented, the luxurious sheets and unfamiliar room confusing her. Then memories of the night before flooded back, the dinner, the storm, Jack's touch, his kisses. She turned, expecting to find him beside her, but the other half of the bed was empty. Rose sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest. Sometime during the night, they had moved from the living room floor to Jack's bedroom. Now she was alone, her clothes from the night before neatly folded on a nearby chair. Had she imagined the connection between them? The way he'd held her, whispered her name, looked at her as if she were precious. She dressed quickly in yesterday's elegant clothes, feeling strangely vulnerable. Today was supposed to be the end of their arrangement. The divorce papers would be filed, the money transferred, and she would return to her normal life. The thought felt hollow now. In the kitchen she found coffee already made, but no sign of Jack. A note beside the coffee pot read simply, "Business call. Help yourself to breakfast. Back soon." Rose poured herself coffee, wandering through the penthouse. In daylight without the haze of champagne and desire, she noticed details she'd missed before. A worn paperback of poetry on a side table, a photograph of a teenage boy with an older man, presumably Jack and his father. Little glimpses of the real man behind the billionaire facade. Her phone chimed with a text message. Rose expected it to be from Jack, but instead it was her neighbor. "Your mom had a good night. Nurse says treatment is working." Relief flooded through her. The money from this arrangement would ensure her mother's care for the next year at least. Whatever confusion she felt about Jack, she had accomplished what she needed. From the living room, she heard Jack's voice. He must have stepped onto the balcony for his call. Rose moved closer to the open door, not intending to eavesdrop, but then she heard her own name. The arrangement with the girl worked perfectly, Jack was saying, his business voice in full effect. The investors signed everything this morning. Rose froze, her heart constricting painfully in her chest. "Yes, the 50,000 will be transferred as agreed," Jack continued. "Small price to pay for what we gained." The coffee cup nearly slipped from Rose's fingers. So that's all last night had been, part of the business arrangement. Perhaps Jack had even planned it, knowing that romance would make her a more convincing wife at dinner. She backed away from the door, setting down her cup with shaking hands. What a fool she'd been to think that someone like Jack Reynolds could see anything real in someone like her. This was always going to be a transaction, nothing more. By the time Jack came back inside, Rose had composed herself, her face a careful mask. He smiled when he saw her, crossing the room as if to embrace her, but she stepped back. "The money's been transferred," he said, his smile faltering at her retreat. "The deal is complete." "Good," Rose said coolly. "Then our business is finished." Jack frowned. "Rose, about last night." "A pleasant bonus to our arrangement," she interrupted. "No need to discuss it further." His eyebrows drew together in confusion. "That's not what I was going to say." "It doesn't matter." Rose gathered her purse, avoiding his eyes. "The contract is fulfilled. I'd like to go home now." "What's happened?" Jack asked, reaching for her arm. "Something's changed." Rose pulled away from his touch. "Nothing's changed. This was always going to end today." "I thought after last night." "You thought wrong," Rose said sharply, hating how her voice wavered. "The fairy tale is over, Mr. Reynolds. We both got what we wanted." A flash of hurt crossed Jack's face before his own business mask slipped into place. "Of course. I'll have my driver take you home." The ride to her apartment passed in a blur of unshed tears. Rose clutched her purse tightly, knowing it contained her phone with the bank notification, $50,000, the agreed price for 1 day of marriage. It felt tainted now, but she would take it anyway, for her mother. When the sleek black car pulled up outside her shabby apartment building, Rose stepped out without looking back. The driver handed her a small box. Inside was the clothing she'd arrived in yesterday, freshly cleaned and pressed. How efficient of Jack to erase all traces of her from his life so quickly. Such a foolish dream, she thought, slipping off the designer dress. Their worlds were too different. Last night had been nothing but a fantasy, a pleasant diversion for a bored billionaire. 3 days had passed since Rose had walked out of Jack's life. 3 days of trying to return to normal, serving coffee, counting tips, calling the hospital to check on her mother. The money sat untouched in her account. She couldn't bring herself to spend it yet, each dollar a reminder of Jack's touch, his smile, the night that had meant everything to her and nothing to him. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. "You look sad," her manager said during her afternoon shift. "Trouble at home?" Rose forced a smile. "Just tired." The truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about Jack. Every customer in a suit made her heart leap before disappointment crashed down. She found herself checking her phone constantly, hoping for a message that never came. "Table 6 needs a refill," her manager called. Rose grabbed the coffee pot and turned toward table 6. The pot nearly slipped from her fingers. Jack sat alone at the table, wearing a simple sweater instead of his usual suit. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as if he hadn't slept well. When he saw her, he straightened, hope and uncertainty crossing his face. "What are you doing here?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to see you," Jack said simply. Rose glanced around the diner. Several customers were watching with interest. "I'm working." "I know, I'll wait," Jack gestured to his empty cup. "I could use that refill though." With shaking hands, Rose filled his cup, then moved to her other tables, feeling Jack's eyes follow her every movement. Her mind raced. Why was he here? To have her sign additional papers. To ask for discretion about their night together? When her shift ended 2 hours later, Jack was still there, his coffee cold and untouched. Rose removed her apron and approached his table. "You've been sitting here for 2 hours." Jack shrugged. "I would have waited longer if necessary." "Why?" The word came out sharper than Rose intended. "You left without letting me explain," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "You misunderstood what you heard." Rose crossed her arms protectively. "I understood perfectly. The arrangement with the girl worked perfectly. A small price to pay for what you gained." Jack ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about a property we purchased from a young woman. It was completely unrelated." Rose wanted to believe him, but fear held her back. "It doesn't matter. We're from different worlds, Jack." "That's not true." Jack stood, stepping closer. "You haven't spent the money." Rose blinked in surprise. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching the account, every hour, hoping you would use it for your mother's treatments." His voice softened. "Why haven't you?" Rose looked away. It felt wrong somehow. Jack gently tilted her face back to his. "I spent the last 3 days thinking about what you asked me. About what happens after I win, after I reach my goal. And what did you decide?" "That I've been chasing the wrong thing," Jack said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I built an empire to prove something to a ghost, but I never thought about what would make me happy." He took her hand in his. "Until I met you." Rose's heart hammered in her chest. "Jack, I'm not offering you money this time," he interrupted. "I'm offering you something much harder for me to give, something I've never given anyone." From his pocket he pulled a small velvet box, different from the one that had held the fake wedding ring. "This isn't for show," Jack said, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond. "This is real. I don't want you to be my wife for a day. I want you in my life permanently." Rose stared at the ring in shock. Around them, diner customers had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold. "I don't understand," Rose whispered. "You could have anyone." "I don't want anyone. I want you." Jack's voice was thick with emotion. "You saw me. Not the billionaire, not the businessman, but me. And you asked me the one question no one ever has, what happens after I win?" He smiled softly. "I want to find out the answer with you beside me." Rose thought of their differences, his wealth, her struggles, the worlds between them. "People will talk. They'll say I'm after your money." "Let them talk," Jack said firmly. "We know the truth. And the truth is, I fell in love with a waitress who challenged me, surprised me, and made me feel more in 24 hours than I've felt in a lifetime." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "You love me?" "Completely," Jack answered without hesitation. "Marry me, Rose. For real this time, no contracts, no time limits." The diner had gone completely silent. Rose looked at Jack, at the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope in his face. She thought of their night together, the connection that had felt too real to be pretend. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes."